All right, so Professor Chomsky, a group of human rights activists in Iraq came to me and asked me to bring these questions to you. They collected these questions from people living in Fallujah, and they feel that the international community has abandoned them, that no one's listening. And as much as they're eager to hear your response to their questions, for their own sake and for their own understanding of what's happening to them, I think they really want the world to hear this too. But first, I was hoping you could help contextualize these questions. The last time we talked about the two U.S. sieges of Fallujah in 2004. Could you give an explanation of what's been happening in Iraq since the withdrawal of U.S. troops in 2011?
Nothing good.
Yeah.
The most dramatic development was the remarkable spread of ISIS and the total collapse of the huge Iraqi army. A couple 100,000 troops, very heavily armed, trained by the United States for 10 years. As soon as a couple of thousand irregulars showed up, they disappeared. And ISIS is undoubtedly a monstrosity. It's now well entrenched in a substantial part of Syria and Iraq. This is an outgrowth of the war. The invasion, among its other horrible effects, helped ignite sectarian conflicts, which had not really existed. There's tensions and so on, as everywhere, but communities were pretty much intermingled. There was no sign of sectarian conflict, but the simply striking a fragile system with a sledgehammer and then instituting sectarian regime very explicitly, then followed by the atrocities and the terror, just set things off. And by now it's tearing Iraq to shreds, tearing the region to shreds. And out of this, and there were other factors. ISIS is in part an offshoot of the extremist Islamist ideology of the main U.S. ally, Saudi Arabia, which is their Wahhabi doctrines are extreme within the whole Islamic world, and they're also a missionary regime. They both with funding and doctrine and establishing mosques, madrasas, and so on. They're trying hard to spread their doctrines everywhere. It's had an awful effect in many countries, and ISIS is an extremist version of that, way out of the range of main Islamic currents. So all of this has come together to create a situation which is, it's extremely hard to find a way out. The Iraqi state credits Iran primarily with their ability to at least defend themselves against the ISIS onslaught, maybe to push it back a little, and is the United States, for reasons that are not totally wrong. I mean, it's a mixed story, are uneasy about having the primarily Shiite militias move into Sunni territory, which could have explosive effects. But it's really hard to think of a way out. Meanwhile, the Kurds have, to some extent, separated themselves to a limited extent, from the conflict both in Iraq and in Syria in somewhat different ways. There are also complex interactions with them in Turkey. But the whole, this is just part of the deterioration of the whole Middle East, North Africa region, which is in a worse state that it's been in living memory, almost everywhere. Libya, Egypt, all over the region. It's a disaster.
So our first question is from a 48-year-old medical doctor living in Fallujah, and the question is, do you think that the daily cases of birth defects and cancer in Fallujah can be considered a war crime or an act of terrorism? ISIS could disintegrate at any time, but this pollution will continue to kill innocent people.
I wouldn't call it an act of terrorism. That understates the nature of the atrocity. A war crime, you could argue, it's a crime against humanity, clearly, since it's a consequence of war, or part of war. Yes, you could claim it's a war crime. The big problem is establishing the facts clearly, and of course bringing them to the general understanding.
The next question.
I should say, just for precedence, there are very clear cases which the United States has managed to fend off. So, for example, the chemical warfare in Vietnam, South Vietnam, has had horrendous effects to the present day because the dioxin has genetic effects, but there's been no move towards even reparations, let alone prosecution. Powerful states can deflect what's called the law. They can bend it to their interests.
This question is coming from a 46-year-old writer. An ordinary observer of Washington's foreign policies might get the impression that they are not driven by self-interest or strategic goals. Is this true? And if not, what are their interests and goals in the region?
I think the interests are very clearly strategic and economic goals, and what's more, they say so. So, for example, for any powerful state, fascist Japan, Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, England, and it's dominating the world, France, any rational person will disregard professions of benign intent because they're universal, and therefore they carry no information whatsoever, so you disregard them. And you look at the circumstances and even at internal documents and at statements that are made under conditions in which they're worth taking seriously. So take, say, the United States and Iraq. When the U.S. and Britain invaded Iraq, there was what Bush and Blair called a single question, right? The single question was, will Saddam end his development of weapons of mass destruction? Within a couple of months, that question was answered the wrong way. So all of a sudden, there was another goal. It wasn't weapons of mass destruction, contrary to what we said before. It was the goal was establishing democracy. Well, you know, in the West, of course, everyone repeats obediently what the master says. There was actually a poll of Iraqis at the time, and I think maybe 1% took it seriously, which is correct. You don't take such professions seriously, particularly under the circumstances. When that claim, which has absolutely no basis in history, was made when the single question got the wrong answer. So we can dismiss that. What were the reasons? Well, actually, towards the end of the war, November 2007, when the scale of the U.S. defeat was becoming pretty evident, and it was a defeat. Iran was the victor, the United States was the loser. Of course, the Iraqis were the losers. But by 2007, it was pretty clear the U.S. was not attaining its intended goals, and at that point, the Bush administration made it clear and explicit what those goals were, formally. November 2007, reiterated January 2008. The goals were to ensure that the United States would have permanent military bases in Iraq, which it, of course, could use as part of its effort to dominate the region, and that U.S. Energy corporations would have privileged access to Iraq's resources. Those were the two explicit goals stated by the president in his November declaration, and reiterated the next January in what's called a signing statement, where some legislation is passed and the president says, here's the parts I'm going to respect, here's the parts I'm going to ignore. And what he said he's going to ignore, Bush and his advisors, is anything that conflicts with these goals. You couldn't have a clearer statement of war aims. Furthermore, it's entirely consistent with not only the policy in Iraq, but the general policy for 100 years I mean, ever since resources were discovered in the Middle East. Yeah, it's been a consistent policy. In the early period, Britain, France, later years, almost entirely the United States as it took over. So this is just a special case of what's been going on for 100 years. It's stated very explicitly by the president. There's no reason to doubt it. So yeah, those were the goals. Perfectly clear strategic goals of a totally understandable kind. I mean, Iraq has probably the second largest energy fossil fuel reserves in the region. They're very easily accessible. You don't have to do deep water digging and so on. They're right on the surface. And it's right in the midst of the major oil producing region of the world. It's the most developed, had been the most developed society in the Arab world. So sure, it's an obvious place to try to establish a client regime, which in fact Britain and the United States have been doing for a century. Don't run through the whole history, but so for example, the 1963 coup was strongly supported, maybe even initiated by the U.S. and maybe Britain, and we know about the way the CIA gave the names of people to assassinate to the coup regime, including Saddam at that point. So it's just a consistent story.
So this next question is coming from a 48-year-old politician. He says, Sunnis in Iraq are currently facing arbitrary arrest, displacement, and ethnic cleansing, but Washington refuses to arm the Sunnis despite their declaration to fight ISIS. Why?
Well, if Washington were to arm the Sunnis, Iran would arm the Shiites even more, and you'd have a major civil war in which the Sunnis would probably be wiped out. Just take a look at the regional, just even the demographic the situation within Iraq and the regional powers that can participate. So I think a care about arming the Sunnis is kind of understandable. It's a little like the question, why not arm the Ukrainians? Well, you arm the Ukrainians, you're creating a very likely war with Russia, which overwhelms everyone else in that region, unless you want to go onto nuclear war, in which case you destroy the world. So if you consider the options, it's understandable.
So this next set of questions is coming from Dr. Muhammad Tarek Al-Daraji. He's a biotechnologist and a human rights activist. His first question is, do you think that the U.S. could help bring peace and development to Iraq by continuing to support the government in Baghdad?
Well, that presupposes that the U.S. has some prime interest in bringing peace and development to Iraq. And the evidence for that is, I wouldn't say slim, it's the evidence to the contrary. I won't run through the history, but let's say just forget the war. Take the sanctions regime in the 90s. I mean, the sanctions regime was so brutal and vicious that it had what was called a humanitarian component, the oil for food program. There were two distinguished, respected international diplomats who administered that program, Dennis Halliday, Hans von Sponeck. Each of them resigned in protest because they regarded it as genocidal. They had detailed information about what was happening. They knew more about Iraq than anyone in the West. And what they were trying to point out, Clinton administration wouldn't allow them to bring it to the Security Council, but what they were trying to point out was that the sanctions were devastating the civilian society, strengthening the dictator, compelling people to submit just for survival, and probably saving him from the fate that had of many other U.S.-supported dictators who had been overthrown by popular uprisings. There's a long list, and meanwhile destroying the society. In fact, Hans von Sponeck wrote a very important book about this, detailing it. I don't think it's ever been mentioned in the United States or Britain. It's suppressed, But is that trying to bring development and progress to Iraq? In fact, has there been any time when the U.S. tried to do that? When the U.S. was strongly supporting Saddam Hussein. I mean, by now it's kind of suppressed, but if you take a look at it, the U.S. supported his attack on Iran strongly, practically won the war for him at the end. After the war was over, the admiration of Saddam in Washington was so extreme that President Bush, first President Bush, sent a senatorial delegation to Iraq in April 1990, a high-level delegation headed by Robert Dole, the chief Republican figure in Congress, later presidential nominee, to convey his greetings to his friend Saddam and to assure him that he should disregard any criticism that he hears in the United States. We have this free press thing, so we can't just stop it, but disregard it. And in fact, even telling him that the U.S. would remove from the Voice of America an anti-Saddam critic. That was April 1990. When you read the transcripts, they're just genuflecting before the dictator. About the same time, the Bush administration invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons production. Now, that's really close alliance. So they loved Saddam, torturing take the Kurdish attack on the Kurds. The worst internal atrocity of the Saddam regime was the Al-Anfal massacres, Halabja, and so on. The Reagan administration just denied that Iraq was responsible. They tried to pretend that Iran was responsible. And Reagan even blocked congressional efforts just for censure. So in short, and if we go back earlier, it's the same story. The United States has been torturing Iraqis for as long as it's been involved in the region. The idea that it's suddenly going to become interested in democracy and development because of some epiphany is, kind of mythology. So the question is, will the U.S. stop trying to destroy Iraq? Will it do something positive, not only for Iraq, but for anyone else in the region? So, for example, is it supporting democracy and development in Egypt when it supports the worst dictatorship that Egypt has had and maybe in its history? Well, of course not. Is it supporting democracy and development when its primary ally, Saudi Arabia, is the most extreme fundamentalist state in the region, makes Iran look liberal by comparison, and is also spreading its pernicious and destructive doctrines? And we're selling them tens of billions of dollars worth of arms, which they are now using to destroy Yemen. Is that creating democracy and development? In fact, what is?
So his next question is, many of the human rights violations committed against Iraqis have not been recognized. Do you think American prosecutors could help us get an independent investigation? How do you advise we go about pursuing accountability and justice?
American prosecutors won't, because because if you trace back these human rights violations, they go straight back to Washington, directly or indirectly, and they're immune. So that's hopeless. But what can be done, and is being done, in many cases, is to appeal to the independent legal organizations, legal advocacy organizations that do seriously pursue human rights, civil rights violations, even when it's people at high places who are guilty of them, like the Center for Constitutional Rights, for example. They do pursue cases like this, and very effectively. They're the ones, for example, who've pursued the main Guantanamo cases. They're supporting Bolivia and its efforts to gain extradition of a mass murderer who the U.S. is concealing, in many other cases. So yes, that could be done. They're highly competent, very good people, and certainly would be sympathetic. It's a hard road to follow because U.S. courts are extremely resistant, understandably, to taking up anything that might implicate people in power. Issues like this are deflected under a doctrine that goes back to Justice Marshall, one of the early important Supreme Court justices, called the political question issue. If you can make it look like a political question, the courts can say, we won't look at it. So, for example, there were many efforts by legal groups, others, to get the courts to declare the U.S. Invasion of Indochina to be a criminal act. I mean, that's the worst atrocity since World War II, but it could never get anywhere in the courts. And, of course, if it can't go through U.S. courts, doesn't matter what other courts do. And just to give you an example, the state of Ecuador right now is actually the population, not the state. Civil society, indigenous societies have sued the Chevron Oil Company for having destroyed large parts of the Amazonian region in which they live. And they won their case in an Ecuadorian court. Is that going to mean anything in the United States?